You're listening to the University of Sioux Falls Campus Ministries Podcast.
Hi everyone, my name's Matt Stiles and I serve as the campus pastor at the University of Sioux Falls. On this podcast, we have conversations with USF staff, alumni, students, and experts in the community to help us better integrate the Christian faith into our particular field. The topic we're discussing this semester is living missionally. Today on the Campus Ministries Podcast, we welcome Joel Fredrikson. Joel is a University of Sioux Falls alum. He graduated in 2006. He went to Sioux Falls Seminary for his Master of Divinity degree and currently serves as the lead pastor at The Point Is to Serve. And beyond all of this, he's a good friend of mine. And so, Joel, we welcome you to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks. It's good to be here.
As we begin this conversation, what we're doing is we are picking a theme and we are having 4 guests that speak on this topic. And so the theme that we've been talking about is living missionally and what that might look like. I'd be interested to hear, how has your understanding of what it looks like to join God on mission grown throughout the years?
Yeah, I think it's gone a lot more from, like when I was in high school, I grew up as a pastor's kid and, middle school, high school, just kind of taking it for granted. And then it was actually when I was a student at the University of Sioux Falls that I really had a deep encounter with Jesus, that it became real to me, and have just been growing ever since then. And really, the Christian faith is so much more significant than I ever thought it was. It's not just this religious thing, but it's an opportunity to partner with God. And I think there was a book that I read, like in addition to the theology classes here at USF, just like learning so much about systematic theology and like, why don't we talk about this stuff? This seems really significant. But then around that same time, I just happened to stumble across Shane Claiborne's Irresistible Revolution. And it went from my head to my heart in a powerful way. And seeing that it's so much more than just this individualistic, how you get to heaven when you die, but it's this whole communal church thing that we get to be the body of Christ in the world, and to be a church that looks like Jesus, hopefully too, because people were drawn to Jesus and they flocked to him because there was something about him that was life-giving good news, and he had living water and the bread of life and everything that we're looking for. And I've just found that to be true on so many levels, and I'm excited about inviting other people into that, not in a kind of a canned way where there's like a formula to it or whatever. You just go up to strangers in the mall, but just like, this is good stuff. Like, you got to get to know this guy. It's everything we're looking for.
It is interesting the lengths we go to make it weird. Where it's like, all right, I got to share my faith, so I'm going to walk up to some random stranger on the street or in the mall. And what's really lacking in a lot of that is the kind of presence that Jesus demonstrates. And when I think of people who practice presence well, you come to the top of the list. And one of the ways that I've seen that is like whenever we go out to eat, a lot of times there's a transaction that happens of you pay for things and then you go and you have your seat. And almost every time you're like, hey, what's your name? I come here often. I should get to know you. And other times they'll just say, hey, Joel. And I'm like, do you know them? And you're like, well, just from coming here. As we seek to embody the good news of Jesus and as we draw near to people, have you witnessed certain things in your own life where you're like, hey, I think this is a helpful way to live in mission with God?
Yeah. I think my grandpa was a huge example to me. Like he just oozed the presence of God. Sounds weird to say, but he did. Like I remember, like even after, like long after he was retired and he was living at the Trail Ridge retirement community, he just knew everybody, and he would say, I want you to meet this person. They were a teacher for 60 years, and like he just knew their whole story and their whole background, and there was no reason for him to know that stuff except for he just cared about them. It's not like he was trying to get them involved in his ministry or something like that because he was retired, you know, like he just actually cared about people. And you could see the dignity in their face when he would recount, you know, their life story and how interesting they were, you know, even if it was just like somebody that worked. I remember he would just say things like he'd be at the airport, you know, and see the person cleaning the bathrooms and look them in the eyes and say, hey, what you do is important, you know, and like to be like on the side of, I don't know, just a very, by the world standards, unimportant position, and to have somebody like look you in the eyes and treat you with dignity and respect with no strings attached and nothing other than to just have the blessing of God working through you into the life of another person and their soul was really big. Another couple that comes to mind is Dan and Minnie Lee. They lived in the Pettigrew Heights neighborhood, like in the heart of like one of the rougher areas of Sioux Falls, and literally opened their house to just anybody who wanted to come in. And they would serve breakfast, and they had a menu, and like we got our youth group involved in it. And so like, and then the kids from the youth group fell in love with it so much that they showed up every single Saturday morning. We'd be there for like 3 hours, and we would like cook these meals for people. And it was like wild because people would come in drunk or high, and they got to know their neighbors' names. And Dan and Minnie, they're like funny and quirky, like they're weird, you know, but like in the most beautiful way, you know. And I just admired them so much, and the kind of relationships that they built there in that place. And it was messy. We were there one time and a guy threw up on the table during breakfast, you know. They just came over and cleaned it up, and everybody like just carried on, you know, like, but it was like, this is wild, you know, like that people would actually do this, and it was unsafe, but they were just pretty reckless about it all. But that was like what led to some of the most beautiful relationships and conversations. And so like, those are the kinds of things that I think of where it's like, dang, but you know, that's an extreme example, but I think there's lots of like small ways that we can do it too. That's just, like you said, getting to know the person's name behind the line. Because I remember in high school working at a grocery store, and you just get treated like you're invisible, like you're just a machine there for them. And when someone actually looked you in the eyes and said like, hey, how's your day going? It's like, oh, like I like you, you know, even as a punk high school kid. So
when you tell that story about your grandpa, I think of one time you telling the story where he was at Trail Ridge, and like you were coming to visit him. And was it a neighbor's grandson or something that he was getting together with?
Yeah. It was actually a kid that was living at Volunteers of America. And my grandpa was telling me that he was mentoring this kid. And at this time, my grandpa's like in his late 80s. Mm-hmm. And so he said, why don't you come hang out with me and this kid? I don't remember his name. So I walk in, and here's Grandpa with this 16-year-old kid wearing a flat-billed hat and a hoodie, you know, just looks like a punk, and they're playing chess together. And I'm just like, that is awesome, you know? Yeah. And the kid loved it, you know, like he was very like open to it. And so we were just hanging out together, and it's just like, man, he never stopped doing that, you know? And there's no one watching, there's no one here to see it, you know? It's kind of like when Jesus talks about like practicing your piety in secret when nobody sees, that the genuineness of it just is like there, you know, and I think that kid felt loved by Grandpa. And it was the son of a lady that worked at Trail Ridge like in the kitchen, you know. Yeah. So it's like, it's not like this is like some fancy doctor, lawyer person with a troubled son. This is like this is a person who's just trying to scrape life together, you know, and he still like just made time for this kid, you know, like that most people would never see and just walk right past and right off, you know. So
it's cool that shows like a double layer to it, right? Yeah. Like your grandpa took the time to get to know the kitchen staff, and so he's practicing relational presence there, and that leads to another connection of relational presence. One quote I remember hearing in the context of youth ministry stuff is that students are likely to gravitate to the oldest person in the room who shows an interest in them. Yeah. And then as I was thinking about that, I'm like, I don't know if that's only true of just students, right? Yeah. That we tend to gravitate towards people who actually lean in towards us. But then there's the barriers of like, but I don't know if I should do that because like, is it going to be weird? I'm not in their age range, or we don't have similar interests, or what barriers do you think there are to us actually practicing relational presence with other people?
I don't know. Maybe it's just we live in such an individualistic society, and we're scared of vulnerability. We're scared of looking stupid, or we're scared of making somebody else feel uncomfortable or whatever. But I just literally heard in our small group this last week, somebody had mentioned that we all love when people are vulnerable, and yet we're the last ones to want to do it. But like when people actually do, we're like, oh, that's cool. Like now we're having a real conversation, you know? And yet all of us have this hesitation to do that, and we miss out. Like how many amazing conversations and opportunities do we miss out on because we're trying to like avoid feeling uncomfortable? And I think a lot of times we think things and we have positive feelings about people, but we don't tell them or say it, you know? Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, it's just maybe too intimate or awkward or something.
Yeah. I think of a class that I was in here at USF where Brian Gregg had talked about, I think it was the Apostle Paul saying what he appreciated about the churches that he was writing to. The assignment, or one of the assignments for the week, was to reach out and do that to somebody. And I remember we had got together with some friends, and we were driving away, and then I thought of that assignment, and I'm like, I need to do it. But I also felt that like, this is weird thing, or like, is this going to be awkward? But I was like, I'm just gonna do it. I don't know like what I perceived in my head, or what we generally perceive of like, are they just going to be weirded out by this? But every time that happens, where you reach out and show the vulnerability of like, hey, here's what I appreciate about you, I've only experienced goodness in response to it.
Yeah.
But it's weird that like, I don't know what gets in our mind there.
Yeah, I don't know. But I've found that when you just do it, cool stuff comes out of it, you know? And even, and I think sometimes it's hard to receive a compliment too. Mm-hmm. But I've also learned too that even if it's not spoken out, you know it landed, and you know it mattered to that person. Yeah. And I think we're just so, like, we just haven't been taught to communicate well. Yeah. I feel like in our culture too. So especially in the Midwest, it's our default to just stuff things, and you know. Yeah. So, but I think that's why Grandpa was so, and Jesus. I mean, like he just went there with people, you know, and that's when they opened up. Like that's how we crack open people's hearts, is to just actually be there with them, like be present to them, like you said, you know.
I was thinking, you know, another possible thing that might get in the way of that is I feel like maybe it's the American productivity side of things, where we're like, we want things to be quick. Mm-hmm. That we like building relational presence takes time and a lot of patience. Yeah. Like I remember one time I went to Grill 26 and went in the bathroom, and on top of the urinal was a Christian tract that shared the good news or whatever. And I was like, first of all, placement is really bad. Like, nobody's going to touch that.
Yeah, what does that say?
Yeah, what in the world? But secondly, it was this very impersonal way that I think was like, okay, I'll just do the minimal amount of effort. I'll throw it on top of a urinal, versus actually having to spend time in a place long enough to get to know people enough. To actually show you care enough that when you share one of the things you care about, Jesus, that actually matters.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of our culture. One of the things I've learned is that I like to go out to lunch with people or coffee or something, and just let it take as long as it needs to take. Like, give yourself a solid 2 hours to be with that person, you know? Because I think sometimes, like, we try to schedule things so we can, like, move on to the next thing. And so we only leave like 45 minutes and like, well, I got to get going, you know? Yeah. And I've found that after you've been talking for about an hour and then you're still there with them, that's when they start to say, hey, here's what's really going on. And then you have like the deeper conversation. And sometimes it's hard because it's like, I got a sermon to write. Like I haven't even gotten started on this thing yet. You're kind of thinking about that a little bit, but I don't know. At the end of the day, it just really is all about the quality of your relationships with people and the amount of space that you make for them, like out of a genuineness and just because they matter to God too. And so you treat them with the same sacredness and value that God gives to them. And, he created them and loves them and died for them. Everybody's worthy of our presence and our time. So
it reminds me of friends that I've been close with, where there's the friendships where like you get together and you just talk, but there's also the friendships where you're close enough to just be with, and you like run out of things to say. And then you start getting into off the surface and into some deeper stuff. But it's interesting in the world of power lunches, right?
Yeah.
Like we're going to get together, going to go X, Y, Z. And I wonder if some of that too is not only that we don't allow enough space for the other people, but we're also not there long enough to actually see that God is doing something. And so it's just like God basically sent us on a mission, but then is hands off. So I just need to have an agenda of get X, Y, Z done in this time period, because certainly God's not here or showing up, versus if my assumption is that God is already present and active and doing something, that's going to take me a little bit to discern and pay attention, or maybe not a little bit, a lot of it. Right? Like I need to like really listen and get to know people. And I feel like that's a factor as well.
I've even toyed with the idea of like just something like even having a short sermon series on like how to have a conversation with people.
Yeah.
Like how to talk to people, because it's just like we stick to our small group of people in our little comfort zone.
Yeah.
And we're content with that, rather than like broadening our sense of being able to just be open to other people. So I think some communication skills would be helpful. I just wish that our culture taught that stuff to us more. But
even thinking of conversational skills, like when we run into anybody who's different than us, we're like, what do we do?
Right. Yeah, I think curiosity is huge. I remember Brandon Johnson, he's the youth pastor at Oak Hills. There's something about when you're in his presence, he like actually seems like he cares about you. Like when you're talking to him, it feels like you're on a podcast and he's interviewing you. Honestly, like, because it's like, I just want to get to know you, And he just like asks so many questions and like follow-up questions and stuff. And I'm like, that is so cool. Like it's so rare that happens. But when someone like gives you that kind of attention and presence, it's like, wow, I really felt like I mattered to that person because they took the time with me,
Yeah.
So, the fact that certain people stand out because they can do that because it's so rare is like kind of sad.
I wonder too about not only practicing this with our neighbors, but what it would look like as a witness to what God is doing in the world for the church to actually be present to one another. Because I think a lot of times, like my early understanding of church is like church is a place that you go to like receive content and maybe sing some songs as an individual.
Right.
But in an age right now where like loneliness is skyrocketing, to offer a community that actually is interested in knowing one another, I feel like that's such a oasis in a world of loneliness.
Yeah. I think of our small groups at church, and I'm in a Tuesday night group. And just the way that like you support each other. And we just had another couple that joined this last week for the first time. They'd never even been in a small group before. And so husband and wife. And it was really cool to have them there and to feel like they can, we were talking about the woman at the well because we're going through John and we were in chapter 4. And so just the importance of vulnerability and how like going there and sharing the deeper parts of our lives with other people, like when we trust them, I think you have to have that foundational relational trust to go there, but that it can be so healing, it frees us from our unhealthy patterns that we get stuck in, That's been cool. I mean, there was even like a couple of weeks ago when we were meeting, it was one of our first nights meeting this year. We were outside because it was so nice out and we're sitting in a circle. And we're on North Kiwanis, which is like, I wouldn't say it's a rough area, but there's a lot of people that just kind of wander around there. And one guy came by and he was pretty drunk and you could tell he was beat up. His face was all bruised and, I don't know, scuffed up. And he came stumbling in to the group and we just had a chair and we opened it up and said, hey, come take a seat. And he told us all about his life and what was going on. And he was, like using some pretty colorful language. And it's just like no one seemed to be bothered by it. At one point, like we asked if we could pray for him. And I just saw people in our group that normally are kind of like quiet and reserved. And like this one gal spoke up and said, "Hey, can I start the prayer?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And then like all these, like, especially like the women in the group, they just like piped up and were praying for this guy, like with like the authority of the Spirit in a way that I was just like really taken back by. And he was blessed by it. And then like afterwards we went and got him some groceries at the gas station next door and then drove him home. And then invited him to come be part of things. And, I haven't seen him since then, but definitely knows that this is a place where if you show up, like, you're going to be welcome.
As you were saying that, I was thinking about how Jesus, when he sent people out, he usually didn't send them out as individuals, but sent them out in pairs. And there is something about like this community of presence that goes out, and all of a sudden, multiple people practicing it together are now sharing that with others, and people use their different gifts or even drawn out in ways that you wouldn't expect of them. I think even the importance of small groups too, where oftentimes I feel like those have been seen as like extracurricular activities of a church. Like there's the service where you're just kind of in a mass of people, like you're just in a crowd, and you kind of get lost in that, versus the smaller gatherings are places to open up that relational space that make the overall thing so much more potent too.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like AA groups.
Yeah.
There's just something about sitting together and confessing that like I'm broken and I've lost control of my life and I need grace. And to be able to do that with other people and not be grossed out by each other's faults, and to be able to take off the mask and be present and no one's flinching. And they're saying, "Hi, Matt." Like they say your name because they're not ashamed of you, and that you're welcome there. If only we could cultivate that in our churches more, and that became the norm, I think it would just be a lot closer to what Jesus had in mind for true kingdom community in the world.
Yeah, well, what would happen if our churches grew into that, looked like that, and practice that with our neighbors? Thanks, Joel, for the conversation, and hope you all join us next time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Matt.